Okay, so for our final lesson in social influence, we're going to be looking at social change. So social change is going to be really similar to minority influence. So if you've not looked at minority influence before now is the time to go back and have a look at that lecture, because otherwise this is not going to make a lot of sense. It does really use a lot of the processes that are involved in minority influence, so it is important to have an understanding of that. So we're going to look at the nuances and how this applies in terms of people conforming and obeying and resisting that pressure to conform and obey. So as a quick recap, what I would like you to do is to have a go at interpreting what these mean. So what do you think is meant by social change? What do you think is meant by social influence? What is meant by minority influence? And what is meant by majority? So hopefully you're going to have an understanding for these three. Social change, maybe not. So now is the time to pause. And I'm now going to talk about what these actually mean. So social influence just generally is how other people affect our behaviour. Okay, so it is just about how do others influence our behaviour, how do they influence our cognitions, etc, etc. Minority influence is what we looked at last week. So in terms of that is a small group of people, or a small or one singular person even, affecting the majority view. Okay, so influencing the majority and changing their behaviour in that respect. Majority influence is often known as conformity, so it's that pressure, it's that most people feel this way, and therefore there's that pressure on you to conform. Whereas social change is what we're going to be looking at today, and this is a societal change. Okay, so this isn't just one or two people, this isn't just for that situation, this isn't just for internalisation, this is a societal change. Okay, so that's what we're going to have a look at. So learning outcomes, hopefully you're going to be able to define what is meant by social change, that you're going to be able to describe the influence of the minority and some relevant research, and the influence of obedience on social change, and the influence of independent behaviour on social change. So that is just any behaviour where someone is not obeying and not conforming. So what is social influence? A little reminder, for those of you who like to think visually, then this is a good way of imagining it. So social influence, we have direct and indirect influences, and indirectly we can say that conformity is social influence, and direct is obedience to authority. So direct, those orders that someone is giving you from an authority figure for you to obey. Indirect is those pressures, and conformity further divides. So we've got internalisation and we've got compliance. We've also got identification, but internalisation and compliance lead to the following: informational social change and normative social influence. So informational social influence can therefore lead to internalisation, and internalisation can happen because of that, and compliance is normally normative social influence. So informational, conform because you want to be right; normative, conforming because you want to be liked, and this all kind of links back together. So how does this happen? It begins with individuals resisting the pressure to conform and obey in poignant situations or experience. So this is just important situations, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that any situations, it's like special situations, special experiences. But we need to look at independent behaviour, we need to look at how people resist that. So we've already looked at that in terms of minority influence, because people have to resist against the majority influence in order to actually be a minority. So what is social change? It is defined as when a whole society adopts a new belief or a way of behaving, and this becomes the norm. So a couple of examples I've got for you include the use of the internet in your daily life. When I was about your age, we did have phones, we did have internet on the phones, but if you click the internet button, you had to cancel it as fast as you could, because otherwise you were going to get charged a fortune and your parents would have killed you. And the introduction of new words into language as well. So selfie, that wasn't a word until 2013. So society does change, and it does adopt new ways of behaving quite regularly. there's been a lot of positive change, for example, towards mental health. Like even in the last 18 months, there's been a positive move towards mental health, and more people are more accepting of it, which is really good. So what I would like you to do is have a little think about some examples of social change that have occurred over the years. So particularly bonus brownie points if you can think of any that have occurred in the last decade. Just have a little think there, and I've got some for you as well. So if you've got a neighbour, share them with those. If not, here's some examples I have. So the smoking ban. It is now not legal to smoke in public places, also not legal to smoke in cars, and that is quite a recent change. Gay marriage, so this only came into effect in 2013, 2014, and even very, very recently Australia voted to have gay marriage rights as well. Votes for women, next year in 2018, 100 years since women won the vote. African American civil rights, obviously that's like been a big thing, and people have kind of largely forgotten about that now. Terrorism, not quite such a good social change. Greenpeace with the role of recycling, etc. Good. Hitler, not so good either. So I've kind of touched on a couple of examples of social change that means that it can be positive or negative. So it can be positive, such as the minority group suffragettes. There they are. And they help to produce positive social change in regards to women voting. So they use lots of extreme methods like hunger strikes, chaining themselves to railings, and those are acts of commitment, if you remember from our minority influence lesson. Whereas an example of negative social change is the rise of the Nazi Party. So they had a few members, and then it grew to have the biggest majority in Parliament. That indicated that their attitudes were the norm, unfortunately, and they used a lot of techniques through violence. So again, acts of commitment, as from what we learned from minority influence. But minority influence has this very special role in social change, because if it gains enough members, it can become the new majority. So Greenpeace, they weren't formed that long ago, and they've helped change attitudes towards the environment. So it's now the majority opinion that we should look after our environment, we should look after the world that we live in, and that was not a view even 40 years ago. So this is kind of the most important slide in this lesson, because this shows you how minority influence plays the role in social change. So I've got the example of the African American civil rights movement in this respect, and this is kind of the process that if you're going to discuss social change, if you're going to discuss questions in it, this is what you need to talk about. So the first thing is about drawing attention through social proof. So you need to actually show that there's a problem, and you need people to pay attention to it. If people aren't paying attention to it, nothing can happen. So there were marches, and they highlighted the segregation within society, for example. 2 is consistency. So there needed to be lots of marches with lots of people taking place. That you couldn't just have the one, because people would see it and then forget about it. Whereas like, you need to have lots of them to be able to keep that in people's minds. This meant that the consistent marches led to deeper processing of the issue. So it makes people think about the issue more, and that is obviously a good thing, because it starts helping to change people's minds. And then there's the augmentation principle. So this is kind of what we've looked at in minority influence in regards to commitment. So there were a number of instances where people risked their lives for the cause, and if people are willing to hurt themselves or show these acts of commitment, then this shows how dedicated they are, and it also means that actually, you know, maybe this is something really important, maybe this is something that we should be paying attention to, because people are willing to get themselves hurt, willing to show risk in order for this cause, and that's really quite important. And then number 5, so this is actually the point where social change happens, and that's the snowball effect. So lots of people paying attention, lots of people noticing the consistency, lots of people noticing the commitment, and when people jump on the bandwagon, when more and more people gain the minority opinion, eventually it reaches this tipping point and it becomes the majority opinion. Okay, so when that happens, that is when social change has occurred. So until the snowball effect happens, it is just a minority influence. After this point, it has become a social change. Okay? So this, up until this point, that is when social change happens. And then there's also social cryptonesia. So this happens a little bit further on. Social change has happened, and this is either for the betterment or detriment of society. But people kind of suffer from this thing called social cryptonesia. And this is where people have a memory that change has occurred, but they don't actually remember how it happened. And then some people don't actually completely forget about the events that led to that social change. So the example that I've got is that I can remember vividly the day that I found out that gay marriage was legalised in the UK. And it was a wonderful day. Like, I can remember where I was and what I was doing when I found out, but I can't remember the date. And I actually really struggle to think about the date that it was legalised, even though I've got that really vivid memory. So I am suffering from social cryptonesia because I know that it's occurred, I know that change has happened, but I can't necessarily remember the date that it happened, and I can't necessarily remember the things that led to that change. Terrorism is also an example of social change. So this was argued by Kriglansky, and he said that social change, that terrorism is a form of social change because they are shown consistency and persistence, they are shown, their members are shown internalization, and they are conforming to this already held attitude, which is a zeitgeist. Wonderful word. Zeitgeist of the present cultural climate. So it's not in the specification, but it is good for evaluation. So this is a good evaluative point if you're doing an essay on social change. But obviously, discuss the theory first, use an example, and then link it back to the theory. So point, explain, evaluate, and then link it back. Okay? So how does this happen in terms of obedience and conformity? So Milgram clearly demonstrates social change in this respect. So again, we know about this in that social support, if you've got a confederate who refuses to give learners the shocks, then obedience drops, and we know this, and this kind of shows and demonstrates social change too. Zimbardo argued as well that obedience can create social change through the process of gradual commitment. So once you have a small instruction, it becomes much harder to resist this bigger one, and people kind of drift into the new behaviour. People argue this, so people don't necessarily agree with Zimbardo in this respect, but you know, it's more evidence and it can help with your evaluation. Some of the studies that might help, so Scott from 1977 found that gradual strategies are more effective than a financial incentive in encouraging people to promote recycling. So again, positive social change. Carducci et al. 1989, completing the questionnaire on organ donation increases the likelihood that people will sign up to be donors. And Zuckerman et al. Found that charities asking for low payments per month and then slowly increasing amounts is effective as the initial value barriers eliminate barriers to refusal. So this is kind of where you get people coming up to you and saying, oh, just for the price of a coffee a week that you can sponsor a child, etc, etc. So if that's already signed up, then it becomes easier to ask them for more and more money. So that's kind of all I have to teach you about social change. The main thing when you're writing these studies and writing these examples is that you need to talk about examples. Okay, so that slide I've spent a long time on talking about you need social proof, etc, etc, that is going to be your AO1, whereas all your examples and things are going to be your AO3. So have a little go at these. That we've got Rosa Parks is an example of a dissenter, so a rebel, a stooge, no, not a stooge, sorry, a rebel, etc. How did her actions result in social change? How can terrorism be seen as an attempt to exert social influence to bring about social change? And with reference to research evidence, two implications of social influence on social change. So remember how we were saying it's positive and negative? Those are your implications. And other than that, have a little, like, this is the last lesson I'll be teaching you about social influence. So other than that, revise, okay? So any questions, come and find me, come and get in touch, come and ask me any questions, and I'll do the best I can, but just revise for your end of unit test, okay? So well done for getting to the end of the course, and thank you very much.